don't get the impression this thing is on. It is? Okay, great, awesome. Awesome, great, fantastic. I'm really glad that we had this talk. So we were talking about the various open source and Linux sites that use Pelican to publish their sites. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the birth of the web. It was a simpler time for those that remember it. We had hand-coded HTML pages. It was something that you did from scratch. Sometimes they looked like this. This is the pre 1.0 Netscape release running on classic Mac OS. It was like as I said, it was a very simpler time. It was static. I mean, that's all there was. You hand coded your HTML. You published your site. You had your content mixed in with whatever tags you wanted to mark up your content with. This was not a very dry, if you're familiar with the acronym, do not repeat yourself. This was not a very dry method. So if you wanted, say you had 20 pages, and you had a header and a footer, well, that meant that you were copy-pasting, more or less, the same page into another text file, and then you've got your header and your footer duplicated in that same file, and you multiply that by 20, and then you figure out a week later, actually, I need to change something. Well, now you need to change that in all 20 places. If it's, say, it was a common element like your header or your footer. So it had some problems. The first version of the web. And the other problem is that this was really only for technical folks. You didn't find someone saying like, oh, I have a business making mittens, and I want to sell my mittens, and I'm going to make a website and I'm going to sell mittens. Or that was just not something that you did unless you were a technical person. So one of the ways that the web kind of evolved to address a lot of those shortcomings is we started to see a couple of different things. Anyone remember CGI, Common Gateway Interface? So this was one way of addressing some of these things. You had a process running on the server that would do things. This was not how the web started out. And one of the things that it would do is generate pages on each request. So the page would be dynamically built on request and then handed to you, the visitor, to be interpreted by your browser. The other thing that changed is that we started to see content stored in a database. Say you wanted to start selling mittens, and you had a variety of different models and colors and knits. You would start to want to store a lot of these things. In one, you don't want to create 2,000 pages for all 2,000 variations of your mittens. So it was easier for a lot of these types of applications to use a database. And one of the other things, in terms of trying to make it more accessible, was someone said, okay, well, how do we make it so that we can edit these things and not have to kind of wade through a bunch of tag soup? And so someone said, well, okay, what if we were to do this via a web editor? And so these are some of the different things that people came up with to address some of these shortcomings. And one of the other ones being templates, where you have some structure to a page and content blocks, and then you would feed your content through the content blocks, and then you get your dynamically generated page. But as anyone who knows anything about software, or evolution for that matter, features are not free. They come with a cost. And unlike evolution, those features don't disappear when they are no longer useful, like they do in evolution. In software, they stay there until you decide that you need to get rid of them. But we'll get to that. Let's see here. There we go. So one of the issues is with deployment. You started out, you just had a web server. So deployment was pretty easy. You took your assets, your HTML that you made, and whatever images you had, and you uploaded them to the server, and you were done. Well, now you have an application server. You have some server-side process that is taking your content, feeding it through, generating the page, doing whatever other server-side processing you need to be done. Well, you now have to set that up and make sure that it's configured correctly, make sure that it stays running. And then in addition to that, if you need it, there's a database server. These are some of the things that start to become involved with most of the things that we identify today as a content management system. And then it's not just the installation and the configuring, you also have to maintain them. So, upgrading your application, if you're using WordPress or, Joomla or Drupal or any number of other content management systems, not just the PHP ones, you have to maintain these things and make sure that they're up to date. Same with the database server. This is a real cost. Content versioning. Sometimes this is built into your CMS, and that's great. Oftentimes it isn't, and it's not something that's easy to do. If it's just a bunch of files, you have a plethora of tools at your disposal for versioning. You can zip them up periodically and do it kind of the old school method. You can use version control, which would obviously be the preferred method. The other maintenance pain is migration. Like, say you decide, I don't want to use this provider anymore, I want to use this other provider. Okay, well, you have to dump the data in your database, move it over to the new one, to this new place, set up your application server, load your database, and pray that somehow that all worked. A lot of times it doesn't. When you have a bunch of static files, it's as easy as download files, upload files. Done. Another problem with content management systems is the stampeding herd. This is not a problem that we tend to have, right? But there's always that dream that someday some high-profile site is going to link to you. You're going to be featured on CNN, and your server is, it's great. You have all this traffic. Congratulations, your server just caught fire and it's not responding anymore. And everyone who visits your site is getting this big loading indicator and not seeing anything at all. You've probably seen this yourselves, and it's not pretty, and I would certainly not want that to happen to anyone. And if you're lucky to have that kind of flow of traffic, the last thing you want is for that to happen. So, this is sort of the theme of our conference: is that letting other people control our devices is bad for us. This isn't something that we want. And one of the nice things about static site generators, as we'll get to, is that you have more control over what's going on. This is a link to an article that just came out last month, and I had already done a whole series of slides on this topic of security. But this person writing for the Association for Computing Machinery makes this really interesting and compelling case that kind of jived with what I was already writing down, that dynamic systems are simply less secure. And this may come as obvious to a lot of people, but it's a real problem to have systems that are running. Everything that you add that's running, the application server, the database server, every one of these things is adding yet another attack vector for someone to do bad things. And he describes it as putting a "kick me" sign on your site. And it's not far off. A content management system treats your content as instructions, more or less. And so if someone who wants to do not nice things, creates this specially crafted blog post, or sometimes even just a comment, on your site, they can somehow get that CMS to execute the instructions that they want executed in order to take control of your server and other not nice things. Another issue is distributed denial of service. When you have a server that is responding to every single request with a lot of dynamically generated stuff, this is computation that in aggregate can really start to tax your CPU, and you can get to a point where if someone turns on the fire hose on your site's not responding anymore. And that's you can have a static site be, with the same issue. You can use a dynamic distributed denial of service attack on a static site. You're just making it that much easier for someone to do it if you're not using if you're using a dynamically generated site. One of the other issues is there's a loss of simplicity. You're no longer talking about just files. One of the nice things about Unix and Linux and such these operating systems is that it's a series of files, and there's this extra layer of abstraction now. You've got this database thing where it's taking little sections of your content and storing it in various places, and it just feels this extra step removed. If I want to manipulate it, I have to go through some web interface. I can't just go and open it up in a text file and edit it. And so this is where static site generators come in. I kind of refer to it as the sweet spot because it's not just handcrafted HTML where you're copy pasting everything, your headers and footers across all the pages, and yet it's not a full-blown CMS where you're logging in and you're doing stuff in a web browser. I call it the sweet spot because it gives you something in between that delivers what I was looking for when I was trying to publish things. And just as an aside, I think it's kind of funny that all that is old is new again. Anyone remember movable type? This is kind of how web publishing started. We all just assume we went from static web to WordPress, but there was a step in between, and it was called movable type, and it essentially did this. It was a static site generator, and it was the most popular tool to publish your site eons ago, and then they made a mistake and changed they started messing with their pricing, and there was this mass defection, and the thing that caught on was Matt Mullenweg's WordPress. It was just everyone kind of glommed onto it, and that's how we got WordPress, which is great for some people and not so great for others. I think I would have preferred movable type, but I'm obviously biased. So what is a static site generator? For those that are not familiar with it, I will describe it. The idea is you have your content stored as files. So instead of logging into WordPress and saying this is my post and this is my post title, you're essentially editing a single text file. The single text file is your post. It is your page. You can give it a title. You can give it a date. You can give it a slug. So a slug meaning the path, on the end of your domain that describes what the URL is for that particular page or post. You can add tags. There's all kinds of different metadata that you can add, all within one single file. It's not just a bunch of fields in a web form that's then writing to who knows how many other relational tables. The templates, and you have templates and content blocks. So you get some of the benefits of the CMS, where you can say, okay, this is a header, this is a footer, this is a sidebar, this is a navigation element. And you can have all of these different things, and you can feed content through those templates without having to repeat yourself. So it's a much drier system than the web of the 1990s. You're generating this locally, and then you're syncing it to the server. So it's a very different way than almost every other content management system works. Most of the time, content management, everything is on the server side. So you're doing your editing on the server, the request comes in, the page is generated, it's being served from that place. Here, you're generating your site on your computer, like right here on your computer, and then when you look at it on your own web browser and you say, okay, I like the way this works, then you transmit it to the server. It's static, it's self-contained, it's just a simpler way of doing things. You can write your content in a variety of different formats. So one of the ways, some of you may be familiar with Markdown. That's probably the most popular markup format for writing posts, or writing content where you then translate that into HTML. There's also reStructuredText, Asciidoc, Textile. You can really take your pick. Most static site generators don't just commit to one of these. They'll give you a choice of whichever one makes sense for you. One of the other nice things about static site generators is speed. When you're not waiting on the CPU to generate your page, you get an extremely fast response. we've all had experiences where we go to a particular site and we wait. And in 2015, when we have 20 and 50 megabit connections, for you to be hitting a link and waiting for 5 seconds for a page to load, I don't even understand how that happens. But this occurs today far more frequently than I think it should. And this is not an issue with static site generators. There's nothing for the server to do other than to hand you the content that's already been pre-generated. There's no reverse proxying. So if you're familiar with how applications are normally done, you have your web server like Nginx or Apache or whatever you prefer, and then you have your application server such as WordPress or some other thing that's doing the processing, and you reverse proxy from one to the other. Well, you don't have to do that anymore. It's just everything lives in Nginx and Apache world. And those web servers are optimized for serving static assets. That's what they do best. And that is the only thing in this scenario that they have to do, is to serve those static assets. So everything is extremely fast. The other thing you get is reliability. There's no app server, there's no database server, there's less moving parts, there's just less things to go wrong. There's been plenty of times where you'll restart a server, and sure, Apache comes up, Nginx comes up just fine. Your app server, some stale process ID, got inserted in there somewhere, and now the app server's not coming up. So you have to figure out why. You have to go hunt down the stale PID and kill it, and then relaunch it, and hope everything comes back up. Well, that, again, another problem that goes away. You have more control. The source content is on your machine. It's not living in a database somewhere. It's always here. When it's living on a database, you have to decide, okay, well, how am I going to do backups? How am I gonna version this stuff? How am I gonna migrate it? When the source content is always on your computer, you don't have to worry about that. You just have better control over your own data. When it comes to deploying your site, you have a similar variety of options. I use rsync. I just have a virtual private instance at either Linode or DigitalOcean. Pick whatever provider you like, and it's $5 a month, $10 a month, something inexpensive, and I just use rsync, and I sync it up there. It takes 3 seconds tops. But if you decide, what, this is a hobby site, and then besides, I don't want to administer a virtual private instance. That sounds like a lot of work. GitHub allows you to publish your site using something called GitHub Pages. So you can actually generate your site, publish it to GitHub Pages. It doesn't cost you a dime, and you get to have all of the benefits without having to figure out how to administer Debian or do some other server-side monkeying that you might not want to do. Yes? Sure. Sure. There's a little bit of machinery, depending on which static site generator you're using, to help facilitate that. So I'm trying to make this somewhat general about static site generators, so I don't want to delve too much into Pelican internals. But there's a little bit of glue that helps that process. I am only tangentially familiar with it because, like I said, I do my deployment via rsync, so I don't actually use GitHub Pages myself. But I do know that there are tons of people in the Pelican community that do. The mechanics of how they do that, I'd have to look into that. But yeah, in addition to GitHub Pages, there's you can use S3, CloudFront. These are Rackspace, Heroku, there's CDNs. There's all different kinds of different places you can use to deploy and publish your site. So now I will talk a little bit about Pelican, just for those that aren't familiar with it. It's written in Python. We have about almost 250 contributors. It's a very rich ecosystem with a ton of themes and plugins. It's really exciting to see people dive in and write plugins when it doesn't do something that they want it to do, and they want to scratch their own itch and say, well, it doesn't do this thing that I want, and they write a plugin and they make it happen, which is really cool. But it's not the only game in town. If you go to staticsitegenerators.net, as of this morning, there were 386 items in the list. It seems like everyone who decides that they want to experiment in a new language, they almost always seem to write a static site generator. So there are tons and tons of them. Choose one that makes sense for you. So when are static site generators not a good fit? If you have a really data-heavy site, and you want to be able to, to query a database and say, of these 38,000 SKUs, show me all the large T-shirts in blue. Probably not a good fit. Not to state the obvious. When you need interactivity, when you need there to be some type of server-side logic or process, this is also, again, not a good fit because the whole point is that there is no server-side process. An example, might be a contact form. There are solutions for this that I'll get to, but if there are other things that you need it to do, or you need some computation to occur, may not be the best fit. One potential, disadvantage that I just throw out there for if you've got like 30,000 pages, to generate that site could take a little while. If you make a change to a common element that's across all those pages, well, it's got to generate all 30,000 pages. Now, if you're not in any particular rush, that's not a problem. But if you have that type of quantity, that might be an issue. And the last, and this is obviously I think the most serious issue is user experience. It's not nearly as approachable or user friendly as it could be, as I think it should be. I'd like to change that if I can. So I'm going to do a quick little demonstration, and we'll see how it goes. Live demonstrations and all that. Let's see here. I guess I picked the wrong week to learn Colmac. In case you don't know what that is, that's a key layout that's different than the QWERTY that most sane human beings use. So you're going to see all kinds of crazy. Okay, so the first thing I did is I created a virtual environment. You don't have to do that. I just did so it's nice and compartmentalized, and the stuff that we're installing, if you're familiar with Python, means that we can install this stuff, and we decide we don't want it, we just toss the virtual environment, and we haven't mucked up our system in any way. I'm going to install a wheel, again, totally not necessary, only did it because it makes the rest of the installation much, much faster. Let's see here. All right. Okay, and then so we're installing Pelican. If you're not using Markdown, then you don't need to install Markdown. I am going to use it, so I'm going to install that. And I'm also going to install Fabric. Fabric's totally optional. It's an automation tool, much like Make, if you're familiar with Make. But it will make it a little bit easier to do some things, as you'll see in a moment. So, okay, great. So it's done installing. I'm going to switch to a project directory, and I'm going to create my project. Oh, yeah, sure. And yes, by all means, this should be interactive, so chime in at any point. Let's see here, where was I? Okay. So, yes, I tested this on a slightly different resolution. It's 11-inch MacBook, but all right, so this is going to be really interesting. So as to where it's going, this is the Pelican Quick Start, and the idea is to make it somewhat easier, to get started. It's this interactive. It's going to ask a series of questions. It's asking me, and I'll repeat it in case you can't see everything. Where you want to create your site. I'm just going to call this Mayors. And where this title going to be, we'll call it Mayorland, because I'm super creative. I'm the author, and English is the default language. We are going to specify a URL prefix just because that's what it's a good thing to do. And here's, all right, great. Do we want pagination? Sure. 10 per page, great. Fab file, do it. Don't need that. Well, don't need FTP, and I'm going to use rsync, so we're going to need SSH. It's going to ask me where my host is. I'm going to tell it the domain of the VPS where I'm going to be hosting this. It's on port 22. My username is JM, and we're going to put that in home JM web mayors. Nope. Dropbox. Nope. So if you want to use Dropbox, S3, Rackspace Cloud, GitHub Pages, going back to GitHub Pages, this helps facilitate it. If that's how you want to do it. Okay, so that's now generated our project, and what I'm going to do next is just create a few. Of course, it's helpful if I first cd into the project, and then. Oh, thank you. And I'm just going to create a couple of directories that are going to come in handy in a moment. So I could use the default theme. The default theme needs a little bit of love. It's like with most things. We tend to focus on the functionality first. The good news is there's a ton of really great looking themes. So I'm just going to clone one of those from GitHub, and we're gonna use that one. But I need to tell Pelican that that's what we're going to use as our theme. So the way we do that is we just specify, okay, the theme is themes mayors. Great. And while I'm here, I could change things like time zone. And again, this is something you would normally do in the context of some WordPress panel. Obviously, this is a little more cumbersome for some folks. But have you looked at a WordPress control panel anytime recently? It's not all as easy as you would think. And then I'm going to add just a couple of let's see here. We'll add a Twitter link so that folks can see. All right, and we're adding, there we go. And we'll change this one just because it's going to be really ugly if we don't. And we'll sort of pretend that that's actually a link to GitHub. Yeah, the rest of it should be good to go. So we made a couple of changes to the config file, and then now the next step is to do a little bit of post editing, or creating, I should say. So we're going to create, not that one. Inside our content directory, we're going to create a post called Tacklebox. I wrote this silly tool called Tacklebox for the fish shell, which is what I'm using to, here is my default shell. And so we're going to do a little bit of work there. Right. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, not what I meant to do. So we're going to add a title first. I'm going to call this Introducing Tacklebox for Fish Shell. We're going to give it a slug. This is so that at the end of mayors.com, there's going to be this, a nice readable URL that contains useful information for search engine optimization and just for visitors who see a link and want to know what the link is about. We'll add a date. We'll add some tags. and then we'll add a summary. The summary is useful because this way we can use it when we want to display a list of posts without having to show the entire thing. So now I'm going to type really fast, and we all can tell how well I type using Colmac. You can see that the syntax that you see here, if you're not familiar with Markdown, I'm creating links. The first one is a reference link with a reference at the bottom. The second one is a inline link, where the link is right there in the middle of the text. So we write our post, and we're going to add some stuff in here for so that we can show what it looks like when we do some syntax highlighting. Going to add a heading with a triple hashtag, and we're going to get all the way to the end. Someday, we get to the references at the end, and then when that's all done, someday. Great. So we've created our post. Now I'm going to save you all of the trouble of doing that with the about page, but I could do that, but there's really it's probably going to be more painful for you than anything else. And so I'm going to just copy over a logo so that we don't have the default logo, so we have a little bit something more interesting to look at. And now we're going to generate the site. You can do this in a number of different ways. By default, you use Pelican commands itself. You can pass arguments to say, like, use this settings file or use that settings file. My content is located here versus there. I want the output to go, over here and not over there. I'm going to use the defaults, and that's one of the nice things about the Pelican Quick Start is it gives you some same defaults. So I can actually just run Pelican, and thankfully, unlike most live demos, there are no errors. It says process one article, no drafts, no pages, and obviously it did it near instantly. I'm going to now change to the output directory so we can see the so once we're in the output directory, I'm going to run the built-in Python simple HTTP server. One of the nice things is that when you have Python pre-installed on a system, even if you never intend to use Python for anything at all, you could use it for this. You can go to any directory containing HTML assets and run this, and it will serve your site. So we're going to go to localhost 8000, and here we are. There is the site. One of the other things that I'll just show you briefly is this question of using Fabric. You can hit fab build, and again, this is just includes a fab file by default, and this is going to run the exact same command. And of course, because it's a live demo, it encountered an error. That's what I would expect. Oh, it's because I'm in the output folder. That's why. So the Fabric gives you like these ways of saying like fab build. I can hit fab serve, and then I can eliminate that last problem where I had to cd into output and then remember to go back to the project. Using fab serve, again, that just kind of comes, you get that for free, and then that way you don't have to remember to go back and forth. You can check out the fab file. It's pretty simple. Includes things like where do you want your stuff, where's your production server, what's the destination path. This all got pre-filled in when we ran the Pelican Quick Start command where it asked me about SSH. And you can do all kinds of other things to you can regenerate so that it automatically, every time you save your content, Pelican will start to regenerate that content so that you don't have to constantly do this dance of save, generate, preview, save, generate, preview. You can just use regenerate, and it'll generate on the fly, so that you can just hit save, switch to your browser, and reload that page, and then you'll be able to see it. So that's how some of the Fabric stuff works. And then I can hit fab publish, and it's now just used rsync, and bam, it's done. So this is already live. So if I were to go to the actual site, in theory, no, not so much. Okay, we'll blame. Oh, there we go. So that's the gist of how static site generators in general and Pelican in particular work. Oh yeah, For some reason, probably because I didn't create the other page that I skipped, it didn't actually show the post. So I'm not. Let's see. So yeah, it should just appear here. It did when I tested this, 5 minutes before the talk started. Again, live demos. But yeah, normally you would see it in all of its glory. You'll just have to take my word for it. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the things on the horizon. As I said, there are some shortcomings, and some of those there are already solutions to. So some of this is not on the horizon, some of it is actually already here. Remember when I talked about if you had 30,000 pages? Well, we can actually cache some of that generation, some of that computation, so that it doesn't have to be done each and every time. We can use parallel I/O to do this generation in parallel, so we're not just having a single core, doing all of the generation. There are ways of speeding this up for people that have really big sites. Again, not an issue for most people. Web-based editing. There are tools that will allow you to edit your content, even though it's in Markdown or restructured text or some other markup format, in a web browser for those that prefer to do that, which could be useful if you're on, say, a tablet or a phone, and you don't have a full text editor available, and you just want to be able to go to your site and make a couple of changes. That's something that could really come in handy. Live page reloading. So I just described live page generation, where Pelican will wait for you to save your file, for example, and it'll regenerate the content. But then you actually have, when you switch to your browser, you have to remember to reload that. Well, someone wrote a tool, and I'll link to it at some point on my site, called SSG Reloader, that will listen for the regenerating that Pelican is doing, and then reload your browser for you, so that extra step is also removed. So, and then all you have to do is save your change, switch to the web browser, and your change is already live. One of the other things that you can do to get past some of the shortcomings in terms of interactivity are to pair a static site with microservices. So you can use something like Disqus. I don't know if you've ever used it before. It's DISQUS. It's a commenting tool that you can add to your site if you want comments. But the problem is, again, your data is somewhere else. You have no control over it. If Disqus gets sold to Facebook next week, and says, well, we're shutting it down, all your comments are toast, and you may not want all of your comments to be gone. And so you can self-host your comments, and that involves a little more work. It involves some type of server-side process. But you can actually have more control over those comments. You don't have to worry about them going away. And you can do the same thing for site search. You can have a search that occurs on your site. Again, usually an interactive feature that you wouldn't get unless you were using a CMS. And something like contact forms. To me, I always look at contact forms as like the canonical thing that I want a static site to do that it doesn't do. And so I use that example a lot. And as I'll show you in a moment, I came up with something that works for me. This is an example. Someone wrote a plugin for Pelican that allows you to do search. It just bothered him that he couldn't do it out of the box. Yes. I'm sorry, can do what? Okay, yes. All of those involve a server-side process. PHP, CGI, all of those involve. So yeah, those are totally acceptable ways of doing it. But it's like, yes, there's no question that you can do that. I've just described a way that, or I should say, I will describe a way in which I did this a little bit different using Flask, which is a Python framework. But yeah, the bottom line is you can't do it just using static assets. at least not any easy way that I'm aware of. There has to be some server-side process. So as I said before, Michael wrote this tool for searching because it was something that he wanted to do, and it's I think he's using Bottle, which is a different Python framework, but it's a simple thing. It's not some big bloated piece of software that you have to install and maintain. It's a very simple, like I think it's a single file solution that allows him to implement search. Yes. A guy named Federico in Italy wanted to be able to edit his Pelican posts using the web, so he wrote this tool called Shoebill that allows him to do that. It's not the prettiest thing in the world, but that's not what he was shooting for. He just wanted to be able to create something that would allow him to make those edits. And so you can actually use this to make your modifications to your content. Even though it's not traditional CMS like WordPress, you can get some of those benefits using, well, again, I call them microservices because they're a little bit lighter weight. Yes. So by default, Pelican uses a library called Python Markdown, and so what that does is you have, what I saw before, where you have like your title, colon, and then the value, and you'll have date, colon, and the value. That's the default behavior that the Python Markdown library uses. As of yesterday, I was able to convince the author of Python Markdown to add YAML support to it. Someone else did the pull request and did it, but I was like, hey, can you release it? It's been sitting there. Because that's now available as of yesterday, the next Pelican release, or the one after, depending on how we decide to do it, yes, you will be able to use YAML if you prefer YAML to the format of metadata that I showed before. So this is an example of a contact form, and what I did is I wrote a very simple, single file Flask application, and all it does is it takes the value of someone's email address when they put it in here, and this is not exactly a contact form, but it's the same concept. This is more of like a pre-launch page, right? Now we're not ready yet. This is something I'm working on, but we're not ready to launch yet. Put in your email address, hit the button, and we'll let you know when we have something to tell you. And so I wrote a simple Flask application, and all it does is it takes the value, it posts it to this Flask application, and in turn turns around and hands that to MailChimp and records it so that when we do have something to announce, like, hey, this thing that you wanted to know that that we are building and isn't ready yet, well, it's now ready for you to try. And whether it's a contact form or whether it's a pre-launch page, either one of those can be achieved via very simple, single file. Whether it doesn't matter whether it's written in Flask or Python or any other language. The idea is you can use these little tiny islands of microservices, pair it with a static-side generator, and get a lot of the interactivity that you thought you needed WordPress for. But there's a lot left to be done here. This should be a much more user-friendly process, than it is. I mean, if you're not familiar with a command line interface, all of the stuff that I just showed you is gobbledygook. And even if you are familiar with it, it would be nice if you didn't have to do that. It would be nice if there was a little bit more flexibility. If you didn't want to do that for whatever reason, you like the tool, but you want someone that who's not as technically inclined to be able to use this tool. So there's a lot of work to do there. I would love to hear about your experiences either with frustrations that you've had with content management systems, experiences with static-side generators, what frustrated you about those, what things worked well, what things didn't. And there's quite a few things here that I really want to solve, and I'm working on. I think there's room for for even further bridging of this gap, because every time me and some of my colleagues go to create a site, we have this quandary. How do we create something that doesn't involve all of the pain points that I talked about with traditional content management systems, that gives you the benefits of the static site generators that I mentioned, but that is not quite so duct tape, twine, and bubblegum. And so we're trying to figure out a solution for that. It's not entirely clear what it looks like, but I've got the kind of outside outlines of how it might work. And so it would be interesting to have a conversation with whoever's interested, and to try to incorporate that into a solution that might work, because replacing WordPress is impossible, and that's not a goal I would want to do anyway. It's a great tool for a lot of people, but it would be nice to have a better alternative. And again, I say better, from my perspective, and it's very, very subjective. So, in summary, the reason why I like static site generators: they're simple, they're reliable, they're extremely fast. They pair very well with this growing trend towards microservices. And more than anything else, and that, again, this is the overriding theme, is you have better control over your software, your data. Thanks very much for listening. And what questions can I answer? Please, don't be shy. Yes. Yeah, it's come up a few times. Oh yes, thank you. The question was, is there a graphical user interface, for static site generators in general, Pelican in particular, perhaps? And the gentleman expressed some interest in working on that. If there isn't, it's been mentioned a few times, and if you look through the issues in GitHub for Pelican, you'll see that there's one rather recently where someone says, is there a GUI for this? If not, I would like to work on one. So there's definitely interest there. There's no shipping GUI as of the moment. So by all means, pile on. We would love to have you. Yes.
Does Pelican or any other static site generators offer an option for outputting HTML that's made for mobile devices or cell phones that optimize for smaller screens?
Great question. So the question was, are there themes or some capability to support responsive designs for mobile devices, phones, and tablets? And the answer is yes. It's very theme dependent. The whole the way that most static site generators work is the theme dictates how the content is it goes through this processing channel and it comes out the other end. But the theme dictates all of the aesthetics around how that occurs. So there's dozens of themes available for Pelican and many other static site generators, and I would say a good half of them at least provide some type of support for responsive designs. So I've been really happy in terms of looking at how some of these themes look on a phone and on a tablet to see that they are quite responsive and they look really nice. Yes. Sure. So the question was about comments and the using a separate service like Discuss for that, or self-hosting, and are there any particular solutions? There's one called ISSO, I believe, ISSO, and hopefully I got that right. Is one of them, and I'll post a list with some of the other ones, because I keep a running list of the different. There aren't that many, but there are a few, and from what I understand, they work pretty well. Yes. Hmm. Yeah. So the question was, what are some good, editors for editing content if you're not familiar with Markdown syntax or restructured text or some of these others that would assist someone with, editing their content and inserting, these somewhat arcane, markup, symbols into them. And I'm familiar with a few different ones. I don't have them memorized. Again, I keep like running lists for all of these things, and so I'll try to post that as well. But there are some good tools that do allow you to do that. I know that there's also tools that are useful for previewing. If you don't want to do it in the browser, if you just want to write like a Markdown post and see it instantly, there's tools that will show you, that will do that generation and preview it like live. I'll try to post a list of all of those because they definitely exist. Yes. I'm not aware of any at the moment, but when I talked about like some of the things that I'm working on, that's one of them, because that's to me a significant pain point. Sorry, and I forgot to repeat the question. The question was, if is there some type of essentially hosted generation where you have your content and then you want to provide that content, to this hosted service of some kind and have that content generated and published, without you having to do the actual generation locally. Did I get that mostly right? Okay. And this is a problem that I identified early on, and I'm trying to solve that. I think that it would be useful for a lot of folks. And this way you have that flexibility. It's not like you're handing over the keys to your content and hoping someone else will generate it. You can generate it locally in this mythical scenario that we're talking about. But if you'd rather not and you'd rather use some external service, my goal is to be able to provide that so that folks don't have to. Yes. The question was, has anyone studied whether using a static site generator would be better for the environment because of less power use? I can honestly say that's something I have never thought about. That's a great question, and I would say almost, by definition, it would be, because you're generating the site one time, you're publishing it, and that's going to be consumed. I mean, I have a site called hackercodex.com. I publish, random things like, here's how to install a fish shell, or here's how to set up your Python development environment on Mac OS X. And I publish there very infrequently. But I get a huge number of page views just because people want to be able to set up their Python development environment, and I posted how to do it. This is something that's viewed probably 1,000 times a day at a minimum, and that's a lot of power that's not being spent generating that on every single request. So I would think so. Yes.
Another thing on that similar topic is that there has been some work that's been done on adapting that to a more computer type of feel to use static instead of dynamic RAM to use less power for exactly that scenario where you can use static to generate the page, and it's intended to use almost zero power except when it's actually serving the page up.
Wonderful.
So that is being worked on.
That's fantastic. Great. We could use it with all the Bitcoin mining that's destroying our ozone layer and heating up our planet. Any other questions? Well, in that case, thanks very much, everyone. Really appreciate you coming.